we now have a new instant classic political U-turn. And it was done on Thursday by Lord Mandelson, who is going to Washington to be the UK's ambassador to the US. His problem was, about 6 years ago, he'd been really quite disparaging about Donald Trump. And today he issued a really quite amazing apology saying that he'd been totally wrong. And I reckon it's gone straight into the history books as one of the biggest U-turns ever. We'll discuss why he's done it and what it means for the UK-US relationship, along with lots of other things, on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris also in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex also in the Newscast studio.
And it's Faisal in the Newscast studio.
Popping up now, it's kind of in our imaginations, is Lord Mandelson, because we started the week, Chris, talking about Keir Starmer and Donald Trump's phone call that they had on Sunday, and everyone was saying, oh, actually, this is very friendly, and actually maybe some of the potential tensions did not emerge, at least in that phone call. But we're still waiting for our new man in Washington to pack his bags and turn up there.
We are, yeah. It looks like it seems to be sort of smoothening out. There's been a few suggestions that it might be a bit bumpy, a few noises off from the wider Trump campaign and Trump camp about the prospect of Lord Mandelson as the UK ambassador, but it looks like that's being smoothened out. And Lord Mandelson, in a way that perhaps only Lord Mandelson can, has made a second appearance on Fox News. He wrote an article for them, for Donald Trump's favourite news outlet, a couple of weeks ago, didn't he? 10 days ago, maybe. Now he has popped up doing an interview, and in which he is lavishing praise on Donald Trump like you would not believe. A bit like, you get a ketchup bottle on the old fish and chips, and and then you go again. It's just gushing. If anyone can get through those sentences without blushing, having previously said things that were pretty disobliging about Donald Trump, then Peter Mandelson is probably the person. But diplomacy, that is the art of diplomacy, I suppose.
I'm always harking back to the Brexit days, and more on that later. But this is the first time we've had a political appointee being an ambassador for a long time. But that U-turn and the way he did it there really does remind me of the diplomats during the Brexit times, where one day they'd be promoting Theresa May's Brexit deal and they'd give you 100 reasons why it was amazing. And then Theresa May would change her Brexit deal, and the next day they'd give you 100 reasons why that one was perfect. And then Boris Johnson came in and did a completely different deal, and they'd give you 100 different reasons why that was. And all with that's what you have to do as a diplomat.
Well, that's exactly that's what Chris says. That's the art of diplomacy, as it were. But what makes this all the more fascinating is this: Peter Mandelson's not a diplomat, and that also, interestingly, Donald Trump doesn't tend to engage in traditional diplomacy, and yet here we have an extraordinary about turn from Peter Mandelson, now talking about how consequential Donald Trump's going to be as a president, the mandate that he referred to there. And it isn't just Peter Mandelson. Of course, we've had a little bit of the same from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, who said some really critical things about Donald Trump in the past, but then recently, for understandable reasons.
Sitting in that seat.
Explained them away on Newscast, or tried to.
The reality of it, of course, as we know, is that these countries have to work together, and Peter Mandelson's got this kind of crucial role in trying to smooth that relationship as much as possible. And at really critical junctures coming up, things like tariffs and what's going to impact on the UK, Peter Mandelson's potentially got a key part for it. But you cannot get away from the fact that this is what's more than a U-turn.
It's incredible.
Turn.
And at one point in this Fox News chat, he pointed out, and of course this is true, but he pointed out that he was appointed by His Majesty the King. As if to imply that Keir Starmer had nothing to do with it.
It might go down quite well. Of course, he's helped by the fact that the Vice President himself said some pretty
that's true,
raw things, I think, about Donald Trump. But to be honest, he's going to have to be the most amazing. He's going to learn his diplomacy 101 is going to have to be learned pretty quickly, because it's the most extraordinary navigation he will have to do, trying to work. Already you've got allies, other allies that are facing tariffs, trying to get the UK on side. And the instinct you might think would be to, do you join forces with others? I imagine that Mandelson will be advising against this. It's kind of 4D chess he's having to play, and that's probably why he was appointed.
Yeah, that, and also the fact he's been a trade commissioner in the past as well, right? So you would think in some ways this kind of territory is very familiar to him. I think the tariffs thing was quite high up the minds of Keir Starmer and the others. Maybe not the King, but Keir Starmer and the others when they, put him forward for the appointment, because he has got experience in that area, if not the direct diplomatic area.
And let's just remind ourselves about what Lord Mandelson said about Donald Trump to an Italian journalist on a podcast in 2019. He described Donald Trump as reckless and a danger to the world. So, yeah, quite different.
It's quite a walk back from danger to the world, isn't it?
And it's quite a hard act for him to follow in the outgoing ambassador, Karen Pierce, who's probably going to get all sorts of damehoods for pulling off that conversation you talked about.
Yeah. And he was hugely respected by the incoming government last summer, and actually securing the various conversations with Donald Trump when he was a candidate, going to see him in New York back in September, and then as we were describing it the other day on Newscast, the kind of conventional public diplomacy between President Trump and the Prime Minister, with the phone calls and the descriptions of those phone calls and all the rest of it. When you've got, within days, no doubt, of Peter Mandelson getting out there, probably the Prime Minister heading out to see the President probably in the next few weeks.
But let's be realistic here. If we go back to that phone call that happened on Sunday, I mean, it's kind of phony, isn't it? Because they didn't talk about anything where they were going to disagree.
There is a way...
So, of course, it was a nice phone call.
Yeah, if you agree not to talk about the stuff you disagree about, then you can agree afterwards that you had an agreeable conversation, which is kind of where they got to.
Yes, for example, they didn't talk about the Chagos Islands being handed back to Mauritius.
Can I clarify? Do we know that they definitely didn't talk about any of it? Because obviously what they put in the readout doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly
Or we're making
all
an
of
assumption.
all of the entirety of the conversation. I mean, I don't know if we have any insight. I don't, about whether anything.
So I was told that they
nodded to on the
hadn't. I was
fringes.
told that they hadn't gone into policy detail, and there was a bit of knock around with the Downing Street spokesman about what precisely had been talked about, and quite a lot was knocked off. But when you read the White House's interpretation of the call, as I think we were talking about with Sarah Smith the other day on Newscast, there was a phrase in it about the importance of a, quote, big word in this context, fair bilateral, i.e. relationship between the two countries, trading relationship between the UK and the US. Well, that sounds rather like the T word, but just not being expressed. Maybe, or whatever. So, and that whole business, that whole sticky area to come, from memory, was not mentioned in the UK's readout of that same conversation. So.
And also, Faisal, it has been so interesting, hasn't it? Because normally tariffs and trade policy is a thing that happens at quite a slow pace. It's either as a product of free trade agreements, getting rid of them, or they're being applied in a trade dispute, and then it takes the other side 18 months to go to the World Trade Organization, and it's that all sorts of bits of paper go back and forward. But that all happened in the space of about 2 hours on Sunday with Colombia, with Donald Trump using tariffs because they wouldn't take back some people that were being extradited or sent or deported from the US. And so it's amazing watching it happening lightning fast rather than it's sort of trade speed.
It's an entirely different use of the tool. Traditionally, the tool is about equalising your trade or
trade policy,
diverting it. Might be about raising revenue, but to be used as a tool of diplomatic coercion is quite something. And literally since Inauguration Day, there's pretty much been an average of 1 every 2 days mentions by the returning president of the use of a tariff in some sort of geopolitical context, whether it's Greenland, whether it's Canada, whether it's Mexico, whether it's China. Colombia sort of came out of nowhere. We're expecting by the weekend some sort of assertion of exactly what's going to happen as regards Canada, Mexico, and potentially China too. But yeah, none of this is it can't perform all these roles, the tariff. What I think is interesting as regards to the UK is that he's also mentioned this separate policy of a universal tariff which could affect everybody, including the UK. Now, our colleague Anthony Zerka has commented, has questioned actually Donald Trump about this, and every time he sort of shies away from criticising the UK in quite a notable way. It's almost like they've decided not to go there. Obviously, in contrast to the First Buddy and his sort of tweeted machine gun-like attacks on British government, although those have calmed down too. One wonders if something's been said by somebody. I'm not entirely sure who those are.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's helpful for the
it's helpful whether it is a success of diplomacy or whatever other back channels might be operating. It's definitely helpful. You've gone from Elon Musk sounding off every half an hour, pretty much, plus the prospect that the early exchanges between the president and the prime minister might have been, if you like, more classically Trump-like from the first term, and the tweets have pretty much ended. or the X's, whatever you call them, and just back talking about Emmerdale Farm again, and the diplomacy at the moment outwardly seems conventional.
I think the fascinating thing about the use of the threat of tariffs from President Trump, and where it leaves that question about volatility and unpredictability that you have to deal with a president like him in the White House, is that he is almost using the rhetoric, the threat of tariffs, as opposed to the reality, to force a conclusion that he wants. So with the Colombia thing, which is, we want to deport these people to you refuse to take it, we're going to slap some tariffs on you. And what is interesting, or what will be interesting to watch, I think, is how the behavioural response that provokes from people like the UK, i.e. all this pre-talk about the prospect of tariffs on the UK, has that led to Peter Mandelson being quite so, effusive in his praise of Donald Trump? Has that led to David Lammy talking about Donald Trump in the way he does? Like, how much does Donald Trump's plan, which is up your rhetoric and anti, you don't know what I'm going to do, but the threat's there on the table, and the response from other countries is then adapted as a consequence of that behaviour?
And Chris, so much of the focus has been on, can Keir Starmer get on with Donald Trump? What about the other side of the equation? What about Labour MPs getting annoyed that he's sounding too friendly to Donald Trump? And I'm thinking about things like on Wednesday night when Trump talks about using Guantanamo Bay to hold migrants that they want to move out of America. I can imagine that to a lot of Labour MPs, particularly ones who were around in that war on terror period, makes their skin crawl.
Yeah, I think I was going to say we're not even in the foothills of this. We've barely put our boots on the beach of this, because I think we're in the very early weeks. We're before that visit that the Prime Minister will make. I think most Labour MPs I speak to at the moment say, look, you've got to attempt to have a plausible and workable diplomatic relationship. President Trump's only really getting going, but my goodness, there's a balancing act over the next few years of Downing Street having to maintain a relationship with a White House that is a Donald Trump White House, whilst at the same time over a parliament where the Parliamentary Labour Party is highly likely to get more fractious, because that's just kind of what happens during a parliament. And that tension between a relationship with a Republican president of the style of Donald Trump and and a party of the left. We saw iterations of it way back, almost a generation ago, with President Bush, Tony Blair, and the Parliamentary Labour Party. This is the 2020s equivalent, I think.
Faisal, now that I've been able to get my false teeth in and say Rachel Reeves' growth speech, might do that as my little morning warm-up.
It sounds like
for my little
singers
Rachel
do before they
Reeves'
start to perform.
growth speech. I noticed you wrote a blog post. Do we still call them blog posts? What do we call them now? For the BBC News website.
I think they're blog posts.
Yes, we're getting very naughty on this programme. You're talking about X, you're talking about Emmerdale Farm, I'm talking about a blog post. Right, Faisal, but you were quite explicit. You were saying the stuff that Rachel Reeves was talking about in her speech on Wednesday in Oxfordshire, whether it was like linking up Oxford and Cambridge with a better train line or a train line at all, whether it was a third runway at Heathrow, whether there was other investments in other places like Old Trafford. You were like, oh yeah, this will stimulate the economy. This will create growth.
Why weblog.
Yes.
If enacted,
I received a fax.
If enacted,
yes.
right?
Like Oracle.
Which is still a big if. We'll get onto that in a minute. But yeah, these are the sorts of projects. I mean, looks like she's gone through them and taken the sort of Economist hit list of the things that you
mean the Economist magazine?
Economists, no,
Economist
smaller,
Okay, yeah.
of what you would do. Not just to promote growth, but also to attract significant inward investment. You take the Oxford-Cambridge link. Now, I say if because we're not entirely clear. And we're not entirely clear exactly what's going to happen with the third runway either. From the bosses of Heathrow, there was a bit of if, there's a bit of conditionality.
Well, yes, because she said, Rachel Reeves, we will support a third runway, but it's up to the owners of Heathrow to come up with a plan by the summer to tell us what they might do.
And they said, we've spent a lot of money and we just want to be sure. So that's where we are right now. They haven't actually announced, the map. Likewise, there's a version of this Oxford-Cambridge link, which is kind of like a sort of virtual super city that kind of has an electrified train line. By the way, that's not in the plans at the moment. And a new road and loads of labs and connects population centres in, Bedford and Milton Keynes in the middle. And, you think about the sum of that. And then crucially, you think about how you sell that to places with all the capital from all the energy bills that we've been paying for the past 2 or 3 years. That's all in the Gulf, or part of it's in Norway too. And they've got that money to spend. They've got the money to burn. They want to invest that. And I don't literally think this, but you can imagine having to buy a big baseball bat to fight off international investors wanting to invest in Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, Fast Links, loads of lab space. That's exactly what international investors would want. So that's what I meant by that. And it's symbolic. Once you get those guys in to invest in Oxford and Cambridge and a third runway, which again, that's a little bit owned by the Qataris, a little bit owned by the Saudis, and they just cannot fathom why you wouldn't want to build another runway. Now, there are various environmental reasons. There's a big debate to be had there. But from their perspective, where they just build 6 runway airports at the drop of a hat, why wouldn't you do that? So it's almost like a gateway. I mean, I literally have met some of these people, and there's sort of eye rolls. Like, why can't you get this sort of done? We respect Britain. We were educated at Sandhurst and all this sort of, and why can't you build railways and airports? And we have so it's that sort of mentality. And I think that's what I was talking about. But to be absolutely clear, I didn't see this speech as a growth plan or a growth strategy, because you really want 30 or 40 projects like this. There was no public money really announced in that speech. Some of it would be backed by public money to help lever in the international investment. There's an industrial strategy we're waiting for. There's a trade strategy. There's an infrastructure strategy. Once you've got that, then you've got a comprehensive plan for growth. Right now, we're not entirely sure. And there's this whole load of trade-offs where I guess the chancellors say will win out in arguments in cabinet.
That's what I was then going to put to Chris. My little mini theory is actually the intended audience of this speech isn't necessarily like Emirati investors. It is people in the Labour Party who will be opposed to this, and it's basically as having a showdown with them. And that's what the international investors are meant to see.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that. Lots of intent, lots of signalling, bit of a showdown. I thought it was quite striking that the most previously vociferous opponents of the third runway at Heathrow, who are within the cabinet, were doing a spot of almost Mandelsonian diplomacy about how their position used to be X and now it is Y, in terms of how they square their previous opposition with now being willing to back it, even if they wouldn't come out and enthusiastically say it was brilliant.
Including Rachel Reeves, who was previously against an airport expanding in her own area.
In Leeds Bradford Airport, although she was a previous backer of the extension of Heathrow, but others like Ed Miliband and Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, were not, and they found ways of accommodating that previous view with the collective responsibility of being in a government that has the opposing view. You do, though, still have significant voices outside of the ring of government collective responsibility, but within the tent of Labour, not least Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, who are vociferously opposing. But yeah, I think intent and signalling, and then also making the point internally to the party. Remember, this was the number one line on the ticket at the election, that growth was the defining mission, and this is their prospectus, if you like, their hope, that this is how you deliver it. So that reminder that, hang on, you were all signed up to this in the first place, even if we hadn't told you quite all of the levers that we might have decided since, or even thought of before, we would then be announcing the pulling of or encouraging others to pull once you're in government.
What's fascinating for me about what she chose to announce that day was the fact she chose to put Heathrow third runway so high, so central to that speech, because I totally hear the argument about, for investors, it's an attractive proposition. And there are arguments that Rachel Reeves were advancing about why it's essential for growth. But it seems to me that when you make what you are billing yourself as a really significant speech on growth, which is such a key part of the government's mission, its number one mission, all the rest of it, and when you put Heathrow right at the top of that, you've got to make it happen, because otherwise it looks like you have failed on something you have billed as really huge. And Heathrow is still hugely contentious. And in practical terms, to the point Faisal's making, there's not a planning application that's been submitted. There's a whole process, no matter how streamlined the government chooses to make it, that it will have to go through. There's huge levels of opposition within the Labour Party, but locally as well. Some people will support it, but there is definitely opposition to it. And then all the questions about compatibility with climate, the arguments that Rachel Reeves is advancing around sustainable aviation fuel, but that doesn't negate the arguments on the other side. the other projects she announced, things like the, Oxford, Cambridge, Silicon Valley Road and all of the, the East Midlands industrialisation, the Lower Thames Crossing, the Trafford plans. The other things seem to me is less contentious, right? But particularly the Oxford, Cambridge plan, which has been in the pipeline for ages as well, let's be totally clear. There's a lot of people on board with that. There will be questions around housing. There'll be questions locally around the transport infrastructure, impact on the countryside. Is it going to deliver for the local communities? Completely. But it's less contentious, I would suggest, than the Heathrow third runway. Less politically contentious, less symbolic. And yet she chose to kind of bank on that Heathrow happening and then saying we're going to get spades in the ground in 10 years. 10 years it's going to be operational, spades in the ground by the end of this Parliament. She has set herself some very specific deliverables that she will now be measured against. And I think that politically was quite an interesting thing to do.
Also, you really get the sense that the English local election campaigns are starting to get going, even though it's not till May.
And we don't know how many local elections there might be.
All these growth things, which in the moment are in the abstract, when it comes to the English local elections, are things that are going to be built where there are potentially elections, and so they could become election issues.
Do they map over?
Well, I haven't done the analysis.
Oh, right.
We don't know where the elections are going to be yet.
Some of them are
Some of them are unlikely to happen.
This is Alex's turf.
Because I suppose my question there is like, when does the rubber hit the road, so to speak, of like these things go from being like notional kind of aspirational things in a speech to actually local disputes where there might be some actual political skin in the game and a governing party loses seats on councils and loses control of councils.
Think the minute that now the government has so firmly committed to these specific projects, those discussions will start happening at a local level. People will either jump on board and be wholly supportive or will raise objections, because you've got to remember the government will talk about this from a national perspective, and they're very clear that they're prepared to have the fight, as they phrase it, to get the blockers, as they put it, out the way. But when it comes to those local tensions, it's going to be the MPs, the councillors, the people on the ground that are hearing firsthand any opposition that may exist.
And I think we focus on the projects because we can talk about them. But as I said, they're undercooked at the moment. But the wider nerdy theory here that the Chancellor's talking about with her team is what we call the supply side. So you go around and you look at all the barriers to growth, and she's literally asking investors and businesses what they are, and then you try and sort of deal with all of them sequentially. But the problem is that one of the biggest elements of what we call the supply side is the supply of workers and jobs, and on that count, immediately, not long term, they've obviously ended up with their tax changes increasing the cost of certain types of labour, particularly low-cost labour, when you include also the rise in the national living wage. So that is an immediate, real, tangible impact upon business, domestic businesses that are noisy and come on our radio shows and on Newscast, versus a sort of theoretical future, long-run, big investor, big economic type shift, which is less certain.
Right, let's talk about the supply of episodes of Newscast, because there's a biggie coming next Wednesday, because we're doing our 5th anniversary special to mark 5 years of Newscast being a daily news podcast. And if you can't beat him, join him. We've ripped off Taylor Swift's artwork, because we're going to make it like a sort of eras tour to do all the different eras that this podcast went through on the way to becoming Newscast.
No, I like it.
Can you guess what the eras are?
Brexit cast?
Yeah, first one.
Newscast?
Yeah. Coronavirus Newscast.
Ah, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Election cast.
Election cast is an era too.
Yeah.
That's it, isn't it?
I don't know when the being sued by Taylor Swift era begins. Possibly next Wednesday. Next Thursday morning, or maybe even tonight. And so, we will be doing that in the Radio Theatre here at BBC HQ in London on Wednesday evening with an audience of Newscast fans. And sorry if you couldn't get a seat in the audience, because actually it does look bigger on TV than it is in real life.
Is it sold out?
Yeah, sold out many times over. Much like Taylor. Yeah. No, there was no dynamic. Yeah, dynamically zero. It was very static pricing of zero.
Get free tickets,
No free tickets either, and there will be no world leaders in executive boxes, and I will not be getting a police escort to get there. I'll just be cycling in like I do normally. Anyway, you will be able to listen to that in real time on Wednesday night from 7 p.m. If you go on BBC Sounds, and if you go to the top of the BBC Sounds app, you've got that little turny wheel bit with all the different radio stations. There will be one like blob there that represents Newscast. So you'll be able to.
We get our own blob.
We get our own blob, and then on
fortnight
Thursday
later.
night on BBC One, you will be able to see a selected section of the shenanigans.
Oh,
Can't wait.
So that's the team meeting. So I hope you all have it in your phone calendars now that you have a phone
My
calendar.
paper
Yeah,
diary.
it's
It's in my
good.
paper diary.
I'm pleased to see you still have a paper diary.
Yeah.
But what if you forget your diary? What if you leave it at home? You're like marooned.
Just don't.
You just don't turn up for anything.
Just take it with you.
Yeah, true. Right, so that's what we'll be doing next week and what you'll be able to listen to. But Alex, I'm going to leave you with a challenge
Okay.
to earn your free ticket to the Rip-Off Eras tour.
Okay.
In a minute, can you summarise the weird little plot line that developed in Westminster today that was Priti Patel versus Kemi Badenoch and then Priti Patel versus herself?
Are you going to time me?
Go.
Okay, so this was Priti Patel, former Home Secretary, who appeared talking to The Sun's Harry Cole, and he challenged her about the record of government of the Conservatives when they're in government, including on her watch, when immigration numbers went up. She seemed to suggest that, she believed it was the brightest and best coming to the UK. She defended the government's record on immigration. She said under the new points-based system post-Brexit, they had the brightest and the best, and a lot of them were Ukrainians coming. It was a markedly different tone to the one that Kemi Badenoch has completely struck since she took over as leadership, when she's effectively apologised for the Conservatives' record. So following that appearance, we had Kemi Badenoch saying then, whoa, no, hang on, we did get this wrong on immigration. We're going to come up with a good plan. And then Priti Patel correcting herself saying, yes, actually, I'm really pleased we're coming up with a plan.
In a
What a
nutshell.
summary.
That's so good. The
Is that pretty much it?
It's a
I'd
bit
like
over,
to
I'd
sprint
say.
towards the finish line then.
Yeah, I
as
know.
well.
Well, I'm running out of time.
And I'm sorry I was starting to laugh. I've just realised for the first time ever, this watch doesn't have a second hand on it. So I was actually just looking at it to just sort of urge you on.
In
really.
my news head, I reckon it was about 1:15, maybe
yeah.
1:20.
But I do know it is time for this episode of Newscast to draw to a close. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure.
Hurrah.
Great.
And thanks for listening. See you again soon. Bye-bye.